In 1986, when you and the Express met with Vince McMahon and you were guaranteed nothing, you were told that there would possibly be action figures, but that was it. If you guys had been offered a downside guarantee, do you think you would have considered it?
Probably not, because the reasons why we didn't consider it were still the same. We're living in Charlotte, beautiful city. We're the World Tag Team Champions, the top heel team for the biggest NWA promotion in the country, working with the best opponents we've got, the Rock and Roll Express, the best opponents in the world of wrestling for us, with a bunch of our friends and people that we knew in the locker room. At that, Crockett had just got his own plane, so we didn't even have to fly commercial a lot anymore. We could get back home some nights that we weren't beforehand. And all those TV shows, Dusty's the booker. We got Trust and Dusty. All those TV shows, I'm getting a 2-minute interview on 2 TBS programs every weekend and 2 hours of syndication every weekend, plus the midnights getting matches. If we'd gone to the WWF, we saw what the road schedule was. They're in California and fucking New York and Florida. They were all over the country at that point. Nonstop. We'd never be home. Who are we going to work with? Yes, they had great teams, but he didn't say, okay, we would bring you in for a run with the Rockers or the Hart Foundation or this or that, and we're going to put the belts on you, or we're going to give you a run. When we started working for Crockett, the first thing he said was, what have you been making for Watts? And we told him, he said, well, I'll guarantee you that or better. Okay. It's not a goddamn written contract with amounts, but that's the way business used to be done in the wrestling business. Vince was collecting talent. He was telling everybody you'll have the opportunity to make more money than you've ever made in your life, which was true for some guys and not for others. He was selling the action figures and the merchandising and everything and the guys did end up making a lot of money on that. But we're heels. Why do we want people to buy fucking action figures of us? If we're doing our job, the only reason they'd want to buy them is to break them or set them on fire in front of us. So that didn't mean anything to us. He didn't tell us anything about you're going to work an angle with so-and-so, or you're going to have a run with so-and-so, or we want to do this and that, like that bookers and promoters did in that era with top guys that they specifically wanted to bring in. So we got the idea that, yes, there's opportunity there, but he's collecting talent. We're happy where we are. We're featured where we are. We're making... And as it turned out, I made more money in 1986 working for Jim Crockett than I ever made working for Vince McMahon when I was in the office. And plus, am I going to get those 2-minute interviews with 8 other managers? Heenan and Slick and Jimmy Hart. And they didn't put heat on not only the wrestlers, but the managers like they did in the Carolinas. And that was our thing. We got fucking legitimate heat. And we wouldn't be able to do that there. And we wouldn't be able to go out and have those 20-minute matches and tear the fucking house down there because they were doing the 8 minutes and get the fuck out. It just didn't fit. So, and you know, we heard nothing in that talk and that meeting that day that they flew us up for to convince us anything different. And he actually came out. He didn't admit it, but he slipped and said it. And I took it wrong then, but now I know it wasn't anything personal, but he admitted that he had not seen us. Now I know after working with him, he hadn't seen anybody that didn't work for him. But when he hadn't seen us, I'm like, why are we fucking here? Ernie Ladd's the one that called us and said, I'm working for Vince. I'm a talent scout. I'm telling you, he's going to take over the world. You're going to make more money than you ever made in your life. He wants y'all to come in. And he talked about you can get a $25,000 signing bonus. Well, when he said that, I'm like, fuck, this is something we've got to fucking talk about. When we talked to Vince in person, there was no mention of any amount of money otherwise than the opportunity. No mention of a signing bonus. No, we're going to give you a run with the belts. You're going to be programmed with so-and-so. We figure it'll be a 2-year run or whatever that you would hear from any other wrestling people in those days. Just action dolls, which were the action figures then. More money than you've ever made in your life will be the opportunity. And he looked at Bobby and Dennis's head and said, And we don't get Juice up here anymore. Well, that fucking made us nervous too. How the fuck you going to have a goddamn hot fucking match without Juice? The whole it didn't. And I think Dennis especially would have gone. Bobby can get along with anything. Dennis would have gone nuts if he'd have gone up there and saw the way that they booked and the things they did and some of the people they put over instead of other people. And just the general lack of the 80s and the WWF, except for the guys who were really into being good, was a time where, because of the road schedule and the substances and the fact that nobody gave a shit. You've seen the fucking tapes of the house shows, Brian. They just walked through those house show matches in a lot of cases, except for the few that you would expect would still excel. It just wasn't us.
Where do you think you would have been, too, if at the beginning of 87, Dennis walked out, even if you were up there?
If we'd have gone, he may have walked out quicker. I don't know. And actually, and I've said this before, the walkout had nothing to do with anything related to professional wrestling or the people in it, and was a personal situation that we found out much, much later, and I can't blame him for. So it would have happened regardless. If the same thing happened in his personal life, it would have happened regardless of where we were, what we were doing. But so who knows? But they would not have been as accommodating as Dusty was to letting us find a new partner and continuing on, because Dusty thought Bobby Eaton was one of the best workers in the business and was quite fond of me as a talent. So he gave us that opportunity. I don't think it would have happened that way up in the big bad New York office.
No, they would have given you someone. Jim, I'd like you to meet Jim Powers.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, this will work.
Did you call Ernie again after the meeting? Did you turn down through Ernie?
No, we didn't call Ernie. I didn't see Ernie again for I don't know how many years after that, until I saw him at some WWF function in the 90s. But anyway, no, we just called Vince's office back and left word, because he was a persuasive person. And we didn't want to get a chance or have a chance of him giving us another sales pitch. But also what happened was, as you'll recall, I've told the story before, we said we will come up and talk, but we're not going to come to the office because we don't want people to know about this and us to get heat here. Because this was before any contracts that Crockett gave out. This was early in 86. I'm thinking April or May. And so they arranged that they would fly us up to New York and pick us up and take us to a hotel, and Vince would come there, and we had the meeting in a hotel room, which they did their part of the fucking deal. But when we were getting on the plane on our only day off that month, me, Bobby Eaton, Dennis Condrey at the Charlotte airport, and we knew nobody would be at the airport because it's a day that Crockett was not running. So we're going to slip in there, and we run into Tully Blanchard's best friend who worked for goddamn was it Continental Airlines, I think, back then. Anyway, he was at our gate, and we're getting on a plane to go to New York, and he knows what the fuck's going on. He said, "Oh, where are y'all going?" "Oh, we're just taking a vacation." What the fuck are we going to say, right? So we got back that night. We went up and back the same night, and it was the following weekend at Atlanta TV that Crockett had his first set of contracts that actually guaranteed money. You know what? We had a contract with Crockett that had no guarantee. That was the old style booking contract. Just said, we'll give you $40 for TV and pay you commensurate with the prevailing practices of the wrestling community on house shows. That was the booking contract, which wouldn't have stood up in court. And I think they knew that because it didn't guarantee any specific amount of money, but none of the guys were challenging it in court because they were just so happy to have something on paper for the first time ever that they thought that meant a big deal, right? And it was a big deal to me. I'd only been in business 3 years. So then when we came back from that trip to New York the following weekend at Atlanta TV, after our brief production meeting in the conference room where Dusty would go over the format, they kept several people back, among us being amongst them, and offered us contracts with guaranteed amounts. And the first contract we signed with Crockett was for 3 years, $100,000 each for the first year, $125,000 for the second year, $150,000 for the third year. And those were minimums. You could make more. And we did. Those were the old deal with the balloon payments. If you haven't made this $100,000 at the end of this 12-month period, we'll give you a balloon payment. Well, we'd made well over that. And the second year, the same thing. And then by the third year, that's when Crockett was starting on pay-per-view, and he was the Sunday night main event show was starting, where they were going to have advertising income and the whole wrestling network. And he was bandying around that the guys were going to be making so much more money. So we were one of the first ones. We got in before Tully and Arn. We renegotiated our contract because the payoffs had been so bad in the early part of '88. That we had 1 week, it was like $600-700. And we went in and said, it's not our fault. You know, we were going to work with Nikita. His wife got sick. He quit the business. We were going to work with the New Breed. They had a car wreck. We're going to work with these people. What the fuck? Jimmy, we've been here all this time. We need a better guarantee. And that's when we renegotiated the new deals, which he thought he was going to be able to pay because the pay-per-view revenue, the advertising revenue from the wrestling networks, we got $225,000 a piece as a guarantee. And that was signed either just right before or just right after Jimmy learned that he was in fucking financial trouble because the deal had been made beforehand, but he went through with it thinking, well, it'll be a year before anything fucking happens anyway. And by the 6 months later, TBS had bought the company. We got our 40 cents on the dollar from Jimmy Crockett and started getting the full amount of the $225,000 a year apiece. If Tully and Arn had beat us in for the renegotiations, they could have got between $250 and $300 apiece. But they were still talking about theirs when Crockett got the bad news. So, I mean, I've never, besides the actual dollar amount, and that's the biggest dollar contract I ever signed, and then found out that even if you signed it, it didn't necessarily mean you were going to get all of it. Me and Bobby and Stan went out in the parking lot at Briar Bend Drive in Charlotte after we signed them. And they looked at me, and Stan said, do you think he's actually going to pay us this money? I said, I don't fucking know, but we got something on paper that says he's going to have to. So that means something. And that's how we ended up not only getting the 40 cents on the dollar settlement, but getting 6 months of big money from TBS was because he'd signed that contract. But like when, the legal department of the WWF said, oh, Jim, we forgot your talent contract is still running, but your creative contract is up, or vice versa. We got to get that to you immediately. I said, that's okay. I'll be here until I decide I don't want to be, or Vince decides he doesn't want me to be. And whatever you put on paper ain't going to change that. And they looked at me like I had turds hanging out of my mouth. But it's true. Regardless of what I had signed, if I wanted to go home, I was going to go home. I went home from WCW while I was under contract. I told Hurt, I said, send me a release or I'll do what I want to anyway, and you can sue me. And if Vince wants you to go home, you're headed home. So,
You said that Crockett signed you either right before or right after he found out that all the money was gone.
Well, see, he started the talks in good faith. I know
that's my question, because obviously it says a lot. If he signed you to those contracts knowing that there was no way he'd be able to fulfill those contracts.
Well, in hindsight, here's what I believe happened. He did believe that's what all that was done for. That's why they bought all the territories and the syndicated networks, and for the wrestling network for syndicated ad revenue. And that's why they were getting into pay-per-view. And even though Vince got him on Starrcade 87, they thought the Bunkhouse Stampede would be different, but he got him on the Bunkhouse Stampede with the Royal Rumble. But then Turner said, we're going to get involved, and the cable companies were pissed. And we started renegotiating right after that first Clash of Champions, where TBS ran it opposite WrestleMania. And so he thought that this was going to mean he was going to get all this revenue that people had told him he was going to make. And we had just got Dusty to bring the Fantastics in. So we had a team to work with that we could prove our value. We're tearing the house down. Now we're going to renegotiate these contracts. But because it took a few weeks, we went in one time and talked to him and told him our bitches and gripes. And, he said, well, we'll discuss it. And then, the second time we met, we said, all right, Jimmy, we need to hear a figure. And he wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't say a figure out loud. And we're already on $150,000, so he knows we want more than that. But he's talking about how the TBS main event show on Sunday, we're going to pay the preliminary match gets preliminary money, the middle card match gets middle money. The main event guys are going to get $1,500 or $2,000 for a TV match. Holy shit. And he's talking all this. So I said, Jimmy, and Stan and Bobby are sitting there and they don't want to say anything, but he won't come up with an amount. So I just blurted out. I said, Jimmy, it sounds like with all this added revenue, we could make $250,000 a piece next year just to get it out there, right? And he said his exact words, well, I don't have here in front of me what I had you figured at, but I believe we're close. I said, well, let's reconvene this fucking meeting when you've got that shit in front of you. And that's what we did. And between that time and the following week, when we came back and he had his notes, I think he found out. Because Sandy Scott remembered the day in question, but couldn't remember the date, just remembered it happening when Jimmy walked into the accountant Dave Johnson's office and walked back out white as a sheet. But I believe that everything was said and it was all drawn up and agreed to. And then he found out, the bad shit. And what could he do? He couldn't come back to us and say, wait a minute, I can't do this. After he'd already agreed to it, number one, it would kill his credibility. And number two, we'd know something was up. And we would say something in the locker room. So I think he went through with it, figuring this is all going to work out one way or the other, but I don't need to do anything for a year. And, that's because we continued right along making the payoffs that we'd been making. He wouldn't owe us anything until a balloon payment at the end of the year. And by the way, that summer, the 88 Bashes picked back up and we started making money and then went into the program with Tully and Arn where we were making $3,000 to $4,000 a week just on that limited run we had with Tully and Arn for part of 6 weeks. And because, I think we got like a $2,500 payoff out of Richmond when the house was $140,000. It was sold out. Flair versus Luger, Midnight versus Tully and Arn. That was in September, a traditionally down month. So we're thinking, this is fucking great. We're farting through silk. And 2 months later, TBS bought the thing and the elevator began dropping.
Sandy Scott told you what Jim Crockett's reaction was. What do you think David Crockett's reaction was when he found out?
Tony, we're out of money. We're out of money.
Dave Johnson says we have no money. Look at him. Just look at him, Tony. Look at him.
Grab him by the honker. No, after the Bashes and then that month of September when we were once again Flair and Luger rematches and Tully and Arn and Midnight. We're drawing those houses. They were trying to talk Jimmy out of selling at that point, him and Jackie and Francis, but it was too late and they didn't want to mess with their mother's, retirement money.
And who knows how Turner would have reacted if they got that far in negotiations and all of a sudden Crockett.
Yeah, if they did, then they'd say, well, then fuck, we're just going to cancel your TV show. So how about that? How about them apples? You like some apples? How about them apples?
Hey, one last question on all this because I find it fascinating. Obviously, there's a lot of different things at play. You brought up the television network. That was the main reason they bought the UWF from Bill Watts was the network of stations.
Jim Ross had put together an incredible syndicated station list for Mid-South Wrestling, or UWF at that point, across the country on local broadcast stations. And they were doing good ratings. It was too early for those guys to get in the game and instantly turned the big ratings and the TV network, syndicated network, into money. Vince had trouble at first, and cash flow and getting paid on those accounts takes a while to come in, but he was first and got it going. But they couldn't get it operating fully in time to give them a revenue stream that they needed. And then it became a lot of wrestling programs are trying to sell time all at the same time. But the syndicated numbers between Crockett and Vince were not all that far apart. Vince just had a better sales staff, was first into it, and had the brand name with advertisers and people like that.
But they bought a lot of different companies, bought the UWF, bought that syndicated network, bought another jet. There's lots of different things. When did you first start hearing the blame being put on Dusty Rhodes?
Well, when I'd read the sheets.
Well, like David Crockett or anyone who worked there. When did you start hearing people in the company put blame on Dusty Rhodes for the financial distress of Crockett Promotions?
I didn't hear a ton of people blaming Dusty when it was happening. It was only afterwards. And here's the thing. Dusty was the booker. He wasn't the owner. He could tell Jimmy Crockett, let's buy another plane. Whose fault was it if they didn't have the money to buy the fucking plane? That's Jimmy has since had taken responsibility and admitted this. Yes, Dusty's booking sometimes got repetitive. And yes, he didn't fucking bring the UWF guys in as a comparable invading force and missed an opportunity there, blah, 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 and all the stuff we've talked about Dusty's booking. But he'd been there for 4 years and he was still selling out buildings in the summer of 88. He'd had a rough patch last of 87, early 88. But ultimately, Jimmy Crockett bears the responsibility. He was still running out of a converted convenience store on Briar Bend Drive in Charlotte. He had the same old family accountant in there that they'd had for however many years. They had gotten too big, all these supposed accounts that were going to come in but didn't, and the money that they were spending and not keeping track of. Dusty never claimed to be the accountant, and that wasn't his job. So if you're a movie studio and you've got a producer that's spending too much money, well, if he's Steven Spielberg and he produces those blockbusters, you let him go with it. But ultimately, even if he's still producing blockbusters, but you're spending more than you're taking in, whose fault is it? The movie producer or the studio itself? If you tell me, Brian Last, go buy a fucking airplane, and I don't have the money to buy an airplane, I'm going to say, Brian, I'd love to get you another plane, but I just don't have the money right now. Which is actually how they fucking found out that they were $2 million in the hole when Dusty said, let's get another plane, baby, because the last 2 years they had the Jabroni jet, which was the Gulfstream. When they got the Falcon jet that was really a jet rather than a prop jet, the Road Warriors, Dusty, Flair, some of the horsemen, J.J. Crockett himself, they took that plane and we got the Jabroni jet, right? You could beat it in a car. It had a cruising speed of 42 miles an hour in the air sometime. With a headwind, you were flying backwards. So he said, let's get a new plane where we put everybody on the same plane and go across the world, baby. And so Jimmy Crockett told Dave Johnson, figure out how we're going to buy this new plane. And that's when he, according to the story Sandy Scott told me, stayed in the office like 3 or 4 days one weekend to catch up the previous 6 months where he didn't know what the fuck was going on. And that's when he called Jimmy Crockett in the office and said, well, we're kind of $2 million in the hole. What? There you go.
And Watts is still waiting for his money.
But fortunately, I'm the only one, by the way, 40 cents on the dollar. I'll say this. I'm the only one. Not the horseman, not anybody else that made his money back off of Jimmy Crockett, because I was the one lucky enough and smart enough to salvage the Mid-Atlantic films. And I've since, over that period of time, made the rest of that $40,000 that Jimmy Crockett owed me in 1988 back.